County Executive Committee to order. We will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And thank you. And we will move on to item number 3 on the agenda, and as public comment. Does anyone wish to address the executive committee on any item? And seeing that we have no public with us, we will move on to item number 4, and that's the approval of the January 12th, 2023 executive committee meeting minutes that were in your packet. What is your pleasure? Motion by Supervisor Robinson and seconded by Supervisor Langenhahn. Any discussion on the agenda or on the minutes as printed and presented in the packet? Seeing none, we'll proceed to vote. All those in favor of the motion to approve the January 12th, 2023 executive committee meeting minutes signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Say no. Motion carried and is unanimous. Thank you. We'll move on to item number 5, and that is the policy issue discussion and potential committee determination. And item number 6 is operational function required by statute, ordinance, resolution, and/or policy. And we'll start with item 6A1, discussion and possible action by the exec committee on a discussion of the strategic plan updates by the standing committees and possible recommendations to the board. And in your packet is the strategic plan, and we'll start with Health and Human Services, and you have the changes that are made. Any discussion on those items? Or I'll throw it to the Health and Human Services Committee Chair, Supervisor Van Cray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have anything to add from the last 2 meetings, so if people have discussion, go for it.
Okay, any discussion? Supervisor Robinson, please.
No green light. At the last meeting, we talked about the whole issue of the opioid issue. Was that brought up at your committee, Michelle?
We didn't talk about it, but I thought maybe public health and public safety talked about it. I thought I remember Boots saying something about it.
Just at the end of the day, I would like to make sure we somehow address that, but I'll save that for later.
Okay. Any other discussion? Okay, we'll then move on to Public Safety Committee suggested modifications. And you can see them below. Any questions or concerns? Public Safety Committee Chair is not with us today.
Chair Gibbs, I'm here. Jean, I'm the vice chair.
Vice Chair Mask, please.
Yeah.
Please. Go ahead.
We went over this several times, and what's in the packet is what the committee agreed to.
Okay, so did the Public Safety Committee agree to pulling out and not duplicating item 12.3? Jean,
Okay, I don't have that up on my screen, but what's in there is what I remember us going through. So I'm going to assume that's correct.
Okay.
I can't make it any bigger. Yeah, no duplications.
Okay, all right, thank you. Any other discussion on public safety's changes? Supervisor Robinson.
Again, was the opioid or the developing an opioid plan relative to the dollars discussed at the committee?
I don't remember.
When I said
I
chair,
don't remember.
chair,
Not at the last meeting, it wasn't.
did you, I know we talked about the role of the Criminal Justice Coordinating Committee.
correct.
Has it gone there? I'd hate to have us miss out on that, and I think it's an important item, given the fact that
Well-
we've got the federal dollars, or the settlement dollars coming in somewhere in the context of the debate on the update to the strategic plan. I would hope that we could put a provision in there dealing with developing that plan for the use of those dollars.
And that is included on the discussion for the executive committee. I felt that it was important to bring it to the executive committee because of the number of different committees that it is impacting, whether it be public safety, whether it be health and human services. But I've learned of it just even now of another issue where it is starting to impact highway workers when they are effectively potential cleaning ditches and being impacted by fentanyl that's been thrown out in possibly a drug chase. The importance, and we will be discussing when we get to item 6.3, the possible uses and the strategies and how we are going to use that. Supervisor Van Cray, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am remembering now, and maybe somebody else remembers also, that I think Matt Boots' point last meeting was that we should go ahead and get this moving forward, and if we needed to make an amendment to add or remove anything in the future, we could do that. And so perhaps the opioid stuff is not in here, but his comment was that we could make an amendment later on to add it, because I think he was just ready to get this moving forward.
Yes, and I remember that discussion, and now that we have officially going to take it up on the executive committee and come up with which committees will be looking at, potential uses for the opioid funding, and maybe that's the appropriate way that we just add it at a later point.
And I was just checking the minutes from the last meeting, and no, we didn't discuss it at the last meeting. It could have been at a previous meeting.
All right, thank you, Vice Chair of Public Safety, Mask. Thank you. Any other discussion on public safety's changes? Okay, let's move on to EEDC. Oops, excuse me, infrastructure. Infrastructure is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Infrastructure Committee did not make any changes. I don't believe there was any discussion at executive when we first presented it for 8.7 and 10.12 that we did review. We made some changes, added some outcome measures. Other than that, there weren't any other changes added.
Any questions on the infrastructure updates? Okay, then we'll move to EEDC.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did not get a chance to go over the plan with the committee because we did not have a quorum last meeting. So I know there was a lot of stuff in there about the Kowalski interchange. I see that most of it is taken out right now, but I would feel more comfortable if I could discuss this with the committee.
Okay. Questions? So do we want to refer EEDC's modifications and the recommendations that came from exec in light of, in fact, when exec took up the issues of the resolution from the community that the Kowalski interchange was not ready for, or their support did not have the funding for the feasibility study, and so for that reason, the executive committee didn't support moving forward on that resolution. That doesn't mean that the EEDC committee is not in support of it. as far as an item, so I would recommend that we do move it back to EEDC. Supervisor Langenhahn, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to make a couple points. The first one being that I want to reiterate what I said last month, which is that I want to support the development of infrastructure for all of our local governments, because ultimately they are, members of our community of Marathon County. But I wanted that reflected in the plan, similarly, that we're going to support everybody, not just one community. So I'm fine with this in theory, but like I said, I think EEDC needs an opportunity to go back, huddle up, and determine what their revisions are going to be. The other thing I was going to add is that taking more time, I think, is fine with me, but I know originally we had hoped to have this adopted in the fall of 22. We're in February of 23. So is it appropriate to put a hard stop on this process? I would float that to the rest of the committee.
The plan is the executive committee's plan. Again, it is the executive committee's will. If they choose to move forward with what we have, they can move that forward. And then if the EEDs, so it's your will. What does this committee wish to do?
Follow up?
Go ahead, Supervisor Langenhahn.
I would support at least giving EEDC the opportunity to meet, because bypassing them seems like a awful step in the process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Okay, is there anything anything else to be discussed by this committee about the EEDC's changes that hasn't been, or that we have forward? Supervisor Robinson, please.
I think at the last meeting, we also asked that the recommendations that Supervisor Zhang had advanced relative to the Greater Wausau Area Prosperity Partnership, those factors be looked at by the committee. And I would ask that if you could look at those as well. They were economic development related.
Okay. Anything else for EEDC? Supervisor Marash.
I just have questions about the following two measures, number 3 and number 4, regarding recommendations for Marathon County government's role in providing affordable quality health care, and then the fourth one for providing safe and affordable housing options. So has there been discussion about what Marathon County government's role is in those two things?
Supervisor Seevelt, please.
Yes, we did go over it. We did have a good presentation from the child care on, let's see, December meeting, I think it was. And it's going to be, it's hard to figure out the help for child care, but we're still working on it. Hopefully we can get something moving on it, but right now I'm at a stall right now.
Well, what
to do.
those recommendations and those measures are is make some recommendations so they will be coming to the full board. It says by August 31st, 2023, with the input from the non-EEDC supervisors and other Marathon County stakeholders, prepare recommendations for Marathon County government's role. So they haven't been provided yet. This is setting a date to provide a deadline of providing what its guidance is.
Okay, thank you.
Any other discussion? Go ahead, Supervisor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I was the one who brought up the word providing, whether that should be removed. So I would just ask that the committee look at that, because if you see how it reads, recommendations for Marathon County government's role in providing, that alludes to the fact that we would be providing health care. So my recommendation is to remove that word from both of those two items. So I would just ask that they have that discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Any other discussions? Okay, we'll move on. Infrastructure, we already discussed. Do we have any left? HR Finance? We didn't have any, we aren't lead on any of those. So with that, what I would suggest is after EE, we'll have this all except for EEDCs. We have basically agreed to, we'll move this to the March meeting and hopefully have had EEDC's input on those recommended changes and recommended looks at the strategic plan updates. So we will move on then to the next item, item 6A2, discussion of possible uses of the opioid settlement funds. And we have Administrator Leonard on WebEx with us and provide some context to the information that's provided from the various counties.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this item. A couple of things really led me to request the chairman to place this on your agenda, seeking some guidance. First, the discussion at the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, which was alluded to earlier. A number of those members indicated they were interested in working to develop and bring forward a recommendation to the county board related to the utilization and allocation of those funds. Second, I had an inquiry from one of our elected department heads seeking to understand kind of the prioritization of the allocation of those funds. Third, the county board, I know everyone on this committee recalls the adoption of the work plan. The developing that plan was really not identified as a top priority for the 2023 work plan. It was listed in those kind of later items that were priorities if action was taken by the board. And then lastly, which was just referenced before, there was some discussion at executive committee at a previous meeting about incorporating the development of a plan relative to the uses of those opioid settlement funds into the strategic plan. So after receiving the question from the elected department head that I referenced, I did reach out to a regional network I have of other administrators to try to baseline information on their approaches and progress. And that's the information that you have in the packet. And I won't go through that in detail, but it's just a real quick summary of some of the questions. Well, it lists the questions that I asked, but then also the answers I received from each of those various counties. Ultimately, the CJCC, the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, remains willing, as I understand it, to take a significant role in developing the plan if the county board would like it to do so, as does the health department. But everything, and certainly I understand that the ultimate decision as to how to allocate those funds and also the process of how to determine how to use those funds, that rests with the board. So therefore, that's my thought process in engaging the committee at this point, is really to seek your direction on what type of process do you envision being used to develop that strategy to utilize those funds. If the direction is that you would like some input and some recommendations from the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council and the Health Department, that they work together to bring forward such a plan for your consideration, I can certainly go back to the CJCC and the health officer and develop a framework. I would envision developing a framework similar to the document that I included in your packet from Chippewa County for that group to kind of work within with some kind of guardrails. Again, I like the Chippewa County guardrails, the idea that the allocation be done through the annual budget process. Funds are only expended in a budget year after they are received, because again, these settlement funds are not guaranteed. And finally, that they can't increase future operating funds. But I'll only go down that path if this committee wants me to do that. Conversely, if your direction is such that the board really envisions the standing committees taking on that work directly. Certainly, myself and other staff can support you in doing that, but I certainly don't want to intrude in terms of process if the board is looking to take that standing committee driven approach. So that's kind of the background for why I asked Chair Gibbs to put this on the agenda. Happy to answer any questions you might have to assist you in the discussion.
Vice Chair McEwen, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the CJCC committee bringing recommendations how to use these funds back to possibly this committee or the entire board, I think is a great idea, because you have representation from the entire criminal justice system, members on that board, including yourself. You're the vice chair, I believe, of the committee. I think that would be utilizing their recommendations would be a great start for this, for the entire board. Thank you.
Other thoughts? Supervisor Robinson?
We've got a bunch of dead mics. So I would support the use of the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. I've been attending all of the opioid conferences sponsored by the Counties Association. And at the last meeting, they asked many of the same questions about where people were and what role they're rolling out, or how they're rolling it out. And I think it makes sense to try to bring the experts in. My only request is that we try to be as open and transparent as possible, in that I'm a little bit, when I looked at Chippewa County, it almost looked like there was a 2-year lag. Maybe I read it wrong, but it looked like they were using 2002 money in 2024. I would hope that we would not delay unnecessarily, try to get those monies rolled out. There's some certainty relative to portions of the settlement as it relates to some of the pharmaceutical companies and other things. And as soon as we've got those assurances, we've got the money in hand, I would hope that we begin to allocate it and not have a delay.
Supervisor Dickinson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My only comment was going to echo what the administrator said, that it's not in his work plan for right now. So if we are going to be doing this in some fashion and using the resource in the administration, then we address it with the strategic plan and modify the work plan accordingly. So I have no thoughts on whether we do it now or whatever. I'm just saying that if we do that, let's get our ducks in a row. Thank you.
Well, I do support moving having the CJCC provide its recommendations, because it does have, it has every component that's represented there, even treatment. So, whether we, what approach we use and where is it best going to be used, there may be various approaches and various directions that come from the CJCC. Whether that be treatment, whether that be prevention, whether it be, as some other counties have utilized right now, an education program that the new F word is fentanyl. I as well, but I think the thing that we need to understand is that the CJCC would be making recommendations. Then the question becomes, do we bring those recommendations back to Health and Human Services? Do we bring them back to Public Safety? Do we bring them back to where is the recommendations going to reside in what those recommendations and adoptions of those recommendations in programming, whether they be for NCHC or others, or Health Department or Health and Human Services. Supervisor Van Cray, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to echo what a few others have said, that I support CJCC kind of taking the lead and forming some recommendations for us. I just want to make sure that the health officer or the health department's also included in the process if they wish to be so. I think they can offer a different perspective than the criminal justice system. Thank you.
Vice Chair McKeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As far as which committee or committees, these recommendations should be referred to, I guess it would probably be best to wait till they come back with the recommendations. And then I guess this committee could determine if it goes to Health and Human Services, Public Safety, or what. But I think once they determine some recommendations, I think that would make it easier for us to decide which committees we should refer to.
Vet them out with. All right.
Thank you.
Very good. All right. Very good. So initially, they'll come back to this committee, and then this committee will determine the appropriate committee to send each portion of their recommendations to. Okay. Administrators, I give you enough direction?
If I can ask just one other topic that's aligned there, and that is in terms of a timeline. As Supervisor Dickinson referenced, it's not currently in the work plan. My sense would be if you wanted those recommendations for the 2024 budget building process, it's going to take certainly some coordination on our part and the allocation of some resources, but I think we can do that. Is that soon enough for those recommendations to be before this committee? So sometime perhaps June, or are you looking for something earlier than that?
Well, I think that we also need to be cognizant of capacity and the CJCC full committee only meets every other month. So, they will be meeting in March and then again in May. So I think June, coming to some information back as recommendations to this committee by June, I think is possibly doable. Is any other thoughts by the committee? Supervisor Robinson?
I think there are a number of pinch points or decision points that need to be brought up. One is securitization, although that seems to have stalled for a variety of reasons. But there may be a need to adopt that schedule based upon some external factors that could impact how we are paid or whether we securitize those funds. So there may be a need for other committees to be involved. But maybe perhaps the best thing to do would be look to the CJCC and then perhaps a work group of that.
I would agree, because we just received notification of another settlement that was just in the works, and that is a settlement with Teva, Allergen, CVS, Walgreens, and Walmart. The distributors, there's about $10 billion in those settlements that are going to be awarded. But those vary from anywhere from a time frame of 5 years to a 10-year payout. So those funds will also be flowing to the county at a future point. We'll look at where the challenge points are as they come up. But you're right. The reason that the securitization has been stalled to some extent is the requirement that is in the settlement, and that is that the dollars must be utilized for the described services or programs that are described in the settlement, and whether or not if that means dollar for dollar, then the securitization and at a discounted rate would not have the exact same dollar for dollar that is provided in the settlement. So those discussions continue, but it's been a sticking point at this point, that we're no closer to actually being able to securitize those. We're waiting for some clarifications on some legal issues. So, all right. Thank you with that. And then we will, Supervisor Dickinson, please.
So then, just to follow up on my comment from before, I guess I would request that on Tuesday's meeting on the 21st, that the work plan be brought up so that the board can approve the administrator's aid in the development of the plan, which is item 6 on his work plan. Then the board can go ahead and vote on it and approve it per what we've decided already.
Okay. We will do that. Any other discussion? Okay, we will move on to the next item on the agenda. NCHC's debt service repayment. Lance, please.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. As all of the members will recall, through your annual budget process, you did charge county representatives to work with North Central Healthcare's executive committee to execute what was termed a restructured debt repayment plan to take into account the county's service of the project debt in calendar years 2022 and 2023. So just to give you an update, at the end of last year, Gary Olson was appointed by the North Central Healthcare Executive Committee to serve as the executive director of North Central Healthcare. Jason Hake was thereafter hired to serve as the North Central Healthcare Managing Director of Administration and Finance. And those parties from North Central and from Marathon County have been working to finalize two things. The first, a lease agreement for the property, and the second is that debt repayment agreement. In the interim, there have been a couple further complicating items. Those, most notably, the state of Wisconsin made some pretty dramatic and, quite honestly, detrimental changes to its county nursing home supplemental payment process. But in any event, we're essentially finished relative to the lease agreement, and Gary and Jason are in the room with you today to walk through with you the proposal for the debt repayment schedule. Now, in speaking with Corporation Counsel Purner, I don't believe you truly need to take formal action today, as I believe I would be authorized to move forward with the lease agreement and the incorporation of that revised schedule. However, I wanted to bring it here for each of you to see and really understand those fiscal implications for the county, particularly through calendar year 2027. Essentially, the schedule is going to necessitate the county having to service a portion of the debt associated with the project until 2027. And really what it does is it's essentially extending the debt repayment term beyond the statutory 20-year bonding period that normally exists with respect to government bonding. And just for context, this was discussed, this idea of doing that was discussed during the original master plan discussions. But we really wanted to be very transparent. From my conversations with Gary and Jason, I don't believe it would be reasonable to expect North Central to service the debt on the property any faster than what they're proposing. But I wanted to bring it here, and also it's going to be discussed at the North Central Healthcare Executive Committee. So that's the background and kind of where we are to this point. And like I said, I understand Gary and Jason are in the room with you this afternoon, and they can walk you through the document.
With that, I'd invite the Executive Director, Gary Olson, and Jason, the Finance Director, please, by all means. Yeah, why don't you come up here? Sure, yeah. That way you got a mic that's usable.
Good afternoon, everyone.
There you go.
All right, thank you. Again, good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here to talk about this. I wish it was under different circumstances, but as Mr. Leonard said, I am the new executive director and was the finance director before this. So Been with North Central for about 9 months. Now, the issue that we've all kind of talked about is how do we service this debt? As you know, we did the budget recently and brought it to you and discussed, actually didn't bring it to you, but discussed during your budget hearings about the fact that we do have a balanced budget this year, unlike 2022. Now, as Mr. Leonard said, we got hit with a major bad news to the budget. The state pulled away about $3.5 million worth of funding from us for nursing homes. That was under supplemental payments and some other CPE payments that they had. Been working with Chairman Gibbs, and actually this impacts Lincoln County also. So we've been working through legislature members. I had a meeting with Pat Schneider about this, and we're trying to figure out how we can get some of that money back. It's kind of a long, drawn-out conversation to get into, but with that, it made it very difficult to come up with this payment schedule as we were working on this. Because as you know, North Central Healthcare 5142 programs, they don't make money. You know, they're not programs that make a lot of money. Now, we can say that the way that things have been done at North Central, money's been left on the table. And Jason, who some of you are familiar with when he worked for Marathon County, Jason is a very good finance director also who knows county finances, knows human services programs, helping us try to figure out where we can maximize our money at to be able to pay this back. Because if you remember, or if you looked at the budget document that we have at the beginning of that document, I showed the county's contributions and they've went down. They haven't went up, they've went down over the years. So with that, we sat down and tried to work out a payment schedule. So this year, which we're very grateful for, Marathon County helped us out with the debt payment. One thing that, and 2022. Now, one thing I want to say is 2022, the budget that was done for 2022 had us a $2.1 million deficit going into the year. When I started in the beginning of June, the discussions I had with everyone was that actually that deficit was more like $4 million. And as I got looking at it, it was true. It was going to be about $4 million. In the summer, we were about $3.6 million to the bad. As we started working on things after I got there, right now we're closing the year, but we're at just under $1 million loss. So I think the number Jason said this morning, we're still closing the year up, was $970,000. Now that's showing as if we made the payment in 2022. So we made strides in 2022. January's done, and we ended the month to the good by about $300,000. So even with the loss of revenue, now I hate to paint a totally rosy picture because we're 1 month in, but I am very optimistic on what the future holds. With the hiring of Vicki Tilka to be our Managing Director of Community Programs, and with Jason and myself, it's the first time that you've had in the history of this organization 3 people that have worked for county government, myself for Langlade County, Jason for Lincoln and Marathon, and Vicki for Marathon. We understand what's needed for county government. So as we move forward with this, 2024, we had the $2 million in there, and then that's a lot because of the loss of revenue that we have in the nursing homes. And then moving forward, we upped it by $500,000 each year until we get, as Mr. Leonard said, to 2028. 2028, we're at the $4.1 million, and then we service the debt all the way through. The debt goes to 2042. With interest, it's about $83.7 million. we built in interest for the money that you're upfronting us at the beginning of just under $700,000 that will be paid at the end of this loan. Now, one thing I will say is, with this, am I still nervous? Yes. I can't stand in front of you with a straight face and tell you we're going to easily make all these, because as I begin this, plus I like this job, I like it a lot, and I don't want to lose it. So you're going to have me doing the best I can with my team to make these payments. But there's only so much we can do. Like I said, our programs are not money-making programs. So as we look at this, this is a plan on what we're doing to move forward. And this, along with getting to our future state that works much closer with the 3 counties, is one of my main visions to work with for North Central. So that kind of lays out where we're at with this. And I'll answer any questions.
Questions by the committee? Supervisor Robinson.
So are we funding the difference out of our fund balance, or how are we covering the debt service for North Central? And I think we had done it with fund balance that's not sustainable. Should we go to borrowing or other things? And are there, I guess the point of raising it is there's an urgency in the part of the county to try to receive some of that back as quickly as possible. And, will we be dipping into fund balance based upon this projected payment schedule? I know you can only get so much out of the operations, but how will this impact our fund balance?
I think that's yet to be determined. I think the thing that will be looked at is knowing this now, we will now know that we have to budget for it, and how we budget for it may mean that we budget for the debt itself, which is going to increase the levy, because as you appropriately point out, we cannot use unrestricted reserves and to that extent. The other option it is looking at possibly moving it on debt, so I think that's yet to be determined as we budget for it. But now knowing what those numbers are, I think the administrator can now appropriately or try to budget for it, keeping in mind that as Mr. Olson's pointed out, this is still going to be challenging getting to these numbers. But I would,
Mr. Chair,
I would invite the administrator to bring forward his thoughts.
I quite simply, I was just going to echo what you indicated, which was this really is before you to enhance your awareness as to kind of where we are, but also as the chair referenced, we can start to plan for that. Currently, the county has been very conservative and thoughtful in its allocation of American Rescue Plan Act dollars. Now, certainly there are limitations with respect to the utilization of those dollars. That said, we can start to develop a plan that first and foremost complies with the restrictions of those dollars, but also services the debt. And we know now what those numbers look like based on the schedule that Mr. Olson and Mr. Hake have put together.
Okay, other questions? Other questions by the executive committee? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And much continued work and yet to do, and thank you for your dedication and where we have gotten so far.
Mr. Chair, then just to make very clear, again, it's not before you for formal action today, but I wanted to make everyone aware of the current situation. Absent significant concern and direction to do otherwise, I will move forward with the finalization of both that lease agreement and the debt repayment agreement. It was agendized for action for you to quite frankly, give me action to the alternative if you chose to do so.
So seeing that there's no action to the contrary, I think the approval by consensus is there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we will move on to item 6B, discussion and possible action by the executive committee to forward to the county board for consideration. Under item B1, a discussion of a potential rule revision, Rule 15D. And the person that brought the request to me, Supervisor Baker, is here to explain what he's proposing as a possible rule change. Supervisor Baker.
Thank you, Chair Gibbs. So just before I actually go into the rule revision, in discussing this with Vice Chair McEwen, he requested that we put this in Rule 3B as opposed to 15D, and that's on the screen. So the verbiage is the same, but it is in a different location. So and it does impact your decision somewhat. I don't know if you can read that. But basically, we have divided. Michael did this, Corporation Counsel. I'm sorry, and we divided the existing Rule 3B into two parts, so that there are two methods for a supervisor to put items on the agenda. One is the existing method, and then the new proposed method, which I'll go over. But then if the standing committee does not refer that to the full board, then there's still the approach where two people can petition the executive committee to forward that to the full board. So essentially, I'll read the proposed rule, which is the same in whether it's in 3 or 15D. Upon written or emailed request of 3 supervisor members of a standing committee, the standing committee chair will add an item to the agenda of the next standing committee meeting that occurs not sooner than 7 calendar days from the date of the request. The motivation for this came out of the budget process. I thought that the budget process was inefficient and ineffective, and there were, just the time we took to go through it. And there were suggestions by supervisors, including some in this room, that the process should have went through the standing committees before it came to the full board. And to some extent, that requires members, supervisors, to be able to put agenda items on the standing committee. And the process that we have right now for doing that is very time consuming. It can take months through the existing Rule 3B to get items on the agenda. So I've been successful at putting items on the agenda several times, but I've also several times it has I have not got them on there. And essentially, this would be a much expedited way to do that. I think it's preferable to the approach we have now, because in essence, you have to have 3 out of 7, typically 3 out of 7 standing committee members to agree ahead of time. And that number was chosen carefully to avoid any question of walking quorums. So if you have 3 people that discuss ahead of time, that avoids the walking quorum question. If we would have made that number 4, then it would still be legal under the Attorney General opinion and the open meetings guide, but you have to be very careful what you discuss, whereas with 3, it can be discussed and it's not leading to that potential question. So initially, I tried to put this on EED to save you the situation where you're voting against your committee members or for your committee members' right to put things on the agenda. But it was deemed to be more appropriate on the executive committee, which was fine. I was not object to that, but essentially I'm essentially, basically you're saying, if you vote against this, it's, that whether you trust your committee members to add items to your agenda, I would think that would be something one would consider before voting, but that's entirely up to you. And then again, this rule is required to have 3 members, 3 supervisors that would agree with the rule that we have in place now, which would still be in place. Any one disgruntled supervisor could just put an unlimited number of items on the agenda. Chair Gibbs would get to decide where they go, but there is no real mechanism in the rule that we have that prevents, any request is basically placed on the agenda. There's no mechanism for discretion on the part of the chair, which is, maybe not a good thing, but at least in this case, with the new rule, you have the safety factor that you have to get 3 people to agree. So I think it's preferable to what we have now, but, we still would have the rule that we have now. So that's basically my proposal, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, questions or comments? Supervisor Robinson, please.
If the purpose of this is to deal with the budget, I'd just like to point out that for the last 2 meetings, and the HR Finance Property Committee has been looking at trying to address some of the concerns that we heard relative to county board or supervisor involvement, and we will be bringing in March a schedule for the year and a revised process that calls for the full board to be involved in a retreat-like setting where we talk about some of the priorities for the upcoming year and other things. So I would encourage you to look at the last meeting. In March, we'll be bringing something to the full board. We will have an expanded role of the committees, but I would like to point out that last year the administrator did go to all of the committees and ask for them to provide input into the budget process. I think part of the problem was that there were an awful lot of new members that didn't fully understand the budget process. So we're trying to look at ways that we can improve the process, make it more transparent, engage members earlier, have a role for the standing committees in helping shape some of those priorities going forward. So we are trying to address that and look to the March meeting for more information.
Any other discussion? Supervisor Vice Chair McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The discussion I had with Supervisor Baker references because I was part of the Rules Committee. I was just thinking about myself. If 3 individuals from my committee, it's not my committee, the Infrastructure Committee would come to myself and ask me to put something on the agenda that's germane to infrastructure, I'm just assuming what I think would be the proper thing. I would assume that committee chair would put that item on there unless there's some reason that committee chair could have with the 3 supervisors that bring this issue to you. I understand what the thought process is. We do have a mechanism now. I don't know if it would be confusing if we had 2 mechanisms to bring something to the board. It's changes a little bit. Like I said, I just feel that 3 supervisors, and I'm looking at committee chairs here. I don't know what they would think if 3 people on your committee would come and ask you to have a discussion on something. Chances would be pretty good that it would be on that committee agenda. But just my thoughts, and I did share that with Supervisor Baker.
I guess I'll make a couple of comments. First off, the one concern that I have is still potentially a walking quorum issue as it pertains if I have an agenda item and I have it and take it up with, and maybe it's not appropriate for me, but let's say some 3 finance committee members have a discussion about an agenda item, and one of them says, no, I don't think that belongs there. So we go to a 4th one. So now we've had 4 people discuss the same issue, and now we potentially have created a walking quorum by discussing that. And I will allow the Corp Counsel to rule and say that that's what he believes is also the correct interpretation of the rule. Now, you get into a gray area when you do that, and you potentially bring questions upon whether or not you're violating that walking quorum. So that's item 1. The other item is if you put that rule in here now, 3 supervisors from the EEDC committee could bring up an item and want the committee chair of the EEDC committee to take up an item that has something to do with infrastructure. And so the appropriateness of the appropriate committee is one of the things that the chair looks at when the requests come to me, is do the items and where do they appropriately belong in being reviewed? By which standing committee does that item get reviewed? Now, Supervisor Baker is correct that he brought some items to a committee chair and asked for those items to be put on the agenda. And I provided the committee chair with my rationale and said that the rationale for those being on the one committee was not appropriate, and I felt that the appropriateness of where that committee would belong would be here, as the executive committee is the committee of oversight for our rules to ensure that our rules are being followed. And so this was asked to be taken to the EEDC committee. This particular rule change was asked to be taken to the EEDC committee, and I said, no, it doesn't belong to the EEDC committee. And my rationale was clear that exec is the committee that is the committee of jurisdiction to ensure that our rules and oversight of our rules. So I provide that context. And the other thing that I understand is what rule are we trying to, or what are we trying to fix? If right now an item is brought to me, it is disseminated to the appropriate committee of jurisdiction, and that committee has to has to put it on the agenda within 60 days. If it's timely, he can do it sooner. The committee chairman can put it on that committee sooner. If that committee chooses to do nothing with it, our Rule 2 right now says that 2 members can bring it to the executive committee for discussion. If it doesn't get approval through the executive committee, and you've already had 2 committees look at it and not approve it, it's not going to get approved at the board because it's a three-quarter majority rule. At least the rule change requires a 2/3 majority. So that's my thoughts. I don't know. I understand what the supervisor is talking about, but the problem that I see is this potentially creates committee shopping that the federal legislature does, as does the state. This rule allows potential committee shopping, and I don't think that that's appropriate of what we're doing. Supervisor Van Cray. Oh, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You just said everything that I was going to say, so thank you.
Okay, Supervisor Langenhan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, and I don't say this from a perspective of, I've been here so long that, I've seen everything happen before, because that's not the case. But, there's some members of this executive committee that have served on Rules Review with me, and I've been on this board for almost 9 years. I know, John, you've been on Rules Review. Rick, I think you've been on Rules Review. Craig, you and I think, have been on for the past 4 terms, something like that. Yeah. And I feel like every term we talk about this issue. I think it started with Chair Hildebrandt. Somehow, some way we started talking about that. I think if not then definitely the second term I was on, we were talking about this because of a number of other issues that came up over the years. And I know that specifically last term, when bringing the item to the full board was discussed at Rules Review, we had very lengthy discussions about how something can be placed on the committee agenda and how something can be placed on the county board agenda. And I think every time we threw something at the wall, we always found something to nitpick, always. And a lot of times when we were nitpicking things, it always went back to the open meetings law. We were always trying to limit the exposure of the supervisors to potentially make a mistake. It's not that I don't trust my fellow supervisors or my fellow committee members. It's just that putting somebody in a precarious position to possibly violate the law, we don't want to create those opportunities out there. That being said, like I said, this situation, I think that last term we were discussing this was pretty much the best solution that we had possible, given the standard that we didn't want to create those opportunities for potential violations. That's not to say that even if exec doesn't support this today, this couldn't be brought up at a rules review committee in the future. But I feel like we're going to keep talking about the same things that we've been talking about for many, many years. So at the very least, I can say that we're consistent. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Dickinson.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. So Supervisor Longahan's comment is telling, right? If every 2 years you're talking about it, then the perception is, or the reality is, that there's an issue. That for whatever reason, some people feel that items that they want to discuss at a committee level or at a board level aren't getting there. So I think that is a trust issue in a sense that people don't feel empowered for whatever reason, rightfully or wrongfully so. They don't feel empowered to go ahead and bring something up to have it on the agenda. They feel maybe as if they bring it up to one person, that it either gets delayed or pushed back or ignored or whatever. That's a perception that maybe some have and maybe they've had over the years. I don't know. I think there is something to be said for the empowerment of supervisors in committees to be able to have maybe more control of what that discussion is. I understand what you're talking about with and what's been said about the walking quorum. I certainly get that. So whether this is done now or done at rules review, I think it has to be addressed in some fashion that supervisors can feel that they are trusted with bringing things forward to be discussed because they feel that issues are important and we wouldn't want to kind of turn them away. That would be my thought. Thank you.
Supervisor Longahan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And those are interesting comments as well, because saying that the system as presented needs to be changed is as distrustworthy as somebody saying that they don't trust their committee members, that they wouldn't violate the walking quorum if they were to go through with this proposed process. It's a two-way street. I just think that given all the discussions that we've had, that there's nothing preventing a supervisor from exercising the existing processes that were in place. That's not taking power away from them. In fact, these methods empower the supervisors to pursue something if they wanted to. All things considered, we could have a process where the committee chair sets the agendas for every county board meeting and nobody gets any input as to how something gets placed on the agenda. That's the opposite extreme. In this case, the supervisors are empowered to pursue these processes in order to influence their committee agendas and the county board agendas. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other discussion? Supervisor Robinson, please.
Let me just direct your attention to item 8A, which is committee members are asked to bring ideas for future discussion. That's on every committee agenda. Rarely are items advanced at that time, and generally, I think when they are brought up at future meetings. So there are mechanisms to ensure that, and are we dealing with perception versus reality? There is a mechanism in place. I'm not sure how many supervisors have availed themselves of it, but there is a process in the rules. This actually goes back much farther than those 9 years that you've been on it, going back to Ken Day, when Supervisor Day was a member, and he wanted to make sure that the minority had a mechanism for bringing items forward. So this has been a discussion that's been taking place for almost 20 years. So the question is, what is the mechanism for allowing people to bring items forward? That's why the rules were written the way they are, to give the minority of a committee or of the board to bring an item before the county board. I'm not aware of any past cases where that's been ignored or not followed through. And look at 8A on the agenda. And if you've got something you want brought up, bring it up at the meeting.
Supervisor Baker.
Thank you. A couple things. One, to start off with, I watched the HR Finance meeting, and I did appreciate that the changes that you're proposing, I think they will be helpful. So thank you for that. Second is, I used 8 2 months ago or a month ago and unsuccessfully. By the time, timing-wise, the issue was resolved before it got onto our meeting. And I'm not being critical of Chair Seefeld. I mean, he worked with me to try to get it on there. It's just the way the system is set up right now. By the time we had the meeting, then I proposed that at the meeting, not ahead of time. Well, actually, I proposed it ahead of time and at the meeting. But then the board voted, the full board voted on the issue before we were able to address it at our standing committee. So in effect, that has been a slight issue. I don't want to blow it out of proportion. But the main issue that I would like to come back to is the issue of a walking quorum. The appellate court of the state of Wisconsin has addressed this issue. The Attorney General does not address it does not take into account the case. I have asked, also another issue, I've asked for an educational presentation at EED. I think we're the educational committee, and that has been turned down on this very issue of how do we address walking quorums. So I asked for that 2 months ago, and that did not get put on the agenda because it was deemed to be not appropriate to EED, that it should go to the full board. That did not come from my committee chairman, I don't think, so I'm not really trying to lay blame for anybody. I'm just trying to make the system work better. And, I think this is an improvement. If the executive committee does not think so, that's certainly their right. There is no recourse because the appeal of the not going past the committee is to appeal to the same executive committee. So, if you choose to vote this down, that's fine. I will just submit 3 people we'll just use the same process and you can say no at that time. I don't need the rule to have 3 members petition to have put something on agenda. I can still do that. So, and I can still do, I can talk to my fellow supervisors. The Keno versus Dane County says I can talk to 3 people. It says if I talk to 4 people and one of them does not agree, then I can talk to another person until I get 3 that agree. If that's not the way that the rule says, then corporate counsel needs to explain that to me, because I have had many discussions with him over this, and I would like his input on whether he thinks I'm wrong or not. So I'm happy to have that discussion. I've sought legal advice. I have not been provided that legal advice, so I'm pretty sure I'm good because I'm doing what I believe is correct. And if that's not, then I need to be informed of that, because I've asked to tell me what the right advice is. So that's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
We have had discussions, we've had education to this board. We've had education multiple times about walking quorums, and I will leave that as it is. And does the Corp Council want to address the issue?
I can just weigh in a bit. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's important to distinguish both some of the case law cited as well as some of the guidance in the Public Records Guide with the risk the risk of a violation of open meetings law rather than the black letter violation. So 3 supervisors out of a 7 supervisor committee meeting and discussing an issue would not constitute a quorum. It could constitute a negative quorum depending on the number of votes that would be needed to pass a particular item. Typically, 2/3 votes are at the full board, though, and not at a committee level. But that is a potential. My concern, and my job as corporation counsel is part of my job, is to be risk averse. I want to make sure I give you advice to make sure that you're not walking into something that you didn't think of. So where something might not be a black letter violation, there is a risk that a supervisor could take something and violate even unknowingly. For instance, if 3 supervisors have a discussion and then one of those supervisors, unbeknownst to those other 2 supervisors, has a discussion with another supervisor. These things very quickly, I think, can get out of the control of the initial discussion. That's when it becomes a walking quorum, even though the initial intent was not to violate the law. So I think the black letter here is 3 supervisors having a discussion and taking it to a committee chair, not a violation. However, it creates a risk and it invites a violation if someone's not careful. And my job is to advise you on being careful under open meetings law, because really the goal of open meetings law is that the business of the government at whatever level is done in the open at the meetings. So that doesn't specifically answer a question, but I think these analyses of whether something violates open meetings law, it's very fact specific. So you can ask me, hey, did this conversation violate open meetings law? And I can say no, but then I don't know what person X did if they talked to person Y and person Z and A, B, C down the road that I don't know about. And the risk when you have one person less than a quorum is greater. So that's why I think caution needs to be made on those types of discussions.
And the other thing that you can change the facts of the circumstance very simply by knowing one of the committee members is not going to be at the next meeting. And now the quorum has changed. And so now you've got a negative quorum with 3 supervisors when you know that a supervisor is going to miss the next meeting. I just think it as our corp counsel is here to provide us guidance and provide us recommendations to stay out of situations that potentially invite the opportunity for a violation. Supervisor Langenhahn.
I was just going to add, Mr. Chair, Corp Counsel, it's my understanding with the showers test that there has to be a presence of a number of people to determine the outcome of a item, correct? And then the second item is to conduct government business.
Correct.
Okay. So could it be said, though, that if there was a member of a committee that was contacting multiple members of that committee, because I think this is also assuming that those 3 members would be in the affirmative, if somebody says no, well, I think the human response is going to be to sort of convince that person to change their mind. And I think once that happens, then the game changes immensely. Really important for the county to consider. It could still end up in front of decision makers to act on. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, any other discussion? Supervisor Dickinson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was looking up some of our code, and it's very sloppy when it comes to agendas. So I would hope that we can clean this up in rules review. For example, Rule 16, which refers to standing committees, 16A2, directly says that the chair of the standing committee establish the agenda for all meetings in collaboration with the appropriate county support staff. Doesn't say anything about talking to the board chair, doesn't talk about talking to other committee chairs or anything of the kind. So now we already know that that's happening because we have another part of our code which says, the board chair is determining where something goes, what committee. So the committee chair is put into a place where they're not even following our code. They're not the one establishing the agenda. Who's establishing the agenda then? Then it's someone else. So that's where I would say to myself, you start questioning who's creating the agendas, who's creating these topics in the agenda. And for me, that's where it comes from. We should be trusting of everyone that we're bringing forth ideas to be discussed that matter to that particular committee and then would come to the full board. We all have to have that. That's, if there's a concern that that's not happening, I think it leads to questions like this, and then we kind of get stuck in the middle year after year after year after year after year. The only other comment I would say is if someone says, hey, on the infrastructure committee, Craig, I'd like to have a discussion about snowmobile usage. Extending the hours of ATVs, right, where we had that big discussion. Now, if I went to two members of the committee, say, hey, I wonder if we should talk about ATV hours or ATV usage. What do you think about that? Yeah, I think it's a good idea. Talk to someone else. Yeah, I think it's a good idea. You're not discussing the topic. What you're saying is, I want to put something on the agenda so we can discuss the topic and then see where it leads. And I think we all have discussions with other folks at different times about what's on the agenda before meetings. And that's a natural thing. We have these discussions. It doesn't mean you're creating a quorum by asking someone a question. Hey, if I ask John a question about broadband ahead of a meeting, that's not a violation. I understand the perception of it. So I guess where I'm going with this is I think this has to be something that we address. I would say at rules review, I would like it to be now. It's clear it's not going to happen now. I mean, I would make the motion, but I suggest it, or probably think it's not going to go anywhere. But I guess that's where those are my comments. So thank you.
Any other discussion? Oh, do we got Corp Counsel and then the Deputy Administrator?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to follow up on something that Supervisor Dickinson just mentioned, which I think is important when we're talking about open meetings law. Another piece of the puzzle there is a tacit agreement between those who are discussing, or a tacit agreement that's developed amongst the discussions to act in a uniform manner. On the other hand, there is a risk of that. So certainly discussing, hey, do you think an item should be on the agenda? That's not a violation, even if it's amongst 4 or 5 people. What is the next natural piece of that discussion? How will you vote? That becomes the issue. And as much as a rule as written doesn't automatically call for a violation of quorum or walking quorum issues in open meetings law, there is a risk there, and my job is to advise you very strongly to avoid those risks as supervisors so that we don't get into the situation where the risk becomes reality. So I just wanted to mention that.
Deputy Administrator Chris, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is just a passing sort of observation, listening to the conversation. And I think that it seems clear that this will come up again, whether at rules review or here. But another piece of this is that when you've all been discussing it, you've mentioned that you're bringing an agenda item for discussion. And I just ask that, from a staff perspective, that expectation of staff with the rule change would be useful to include in the thinking, so that, for instance, if the proposed rule was there, 7 calendar days may not be enough time for staff to really get the committee what they need to take an action on an item, but it would be clearly enough time for us to gather things to discuss. And so I just want to make sure that whatever the change ends up being, if there is a change, that the expectation of staff is kind of included in the thinking of it, so that we're in a position to support you the way you want to be supported.
Supervisor Longenham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is Lance still with us?
Administrator Leonard?
Yes, I am here.
Lance, maybe you can confirm something. I think a cobweb just shifted in my head. Did we not last session ask staff or direct staff to research how other counties put agenda or how items get placed on their agenda? Because for some odd reason, the Sheboygan County keeps popping up in my thoughts right now. And I think it's because we looked at their process pretty extensively. And I know you staffed rules review last term, so I want to make sure that I'm on the right path, that we've already looked at how other counties do things.
That was one of the areas that staff was asked to gather information, and you're correct. Sheboygan County was one of the counties that we sought information from it. I think Kim took a lead on getting some of that information. But as I recall, Sheboygan County's mechanism that we really looked at was how items got to the full board. So in terms of past history in Marathon County, prior to, I believe, the most recent iteration of rules review, any two supervisors were empowered to bring a matter to the county board, as was referenced in your previous comments. That has been an item of frequent discussion, and at rules review in the last session, this new process was identified. I don't know, Kim, if you can recall specifically what other information we looked at. I know the primary piece that we went and researched was how many county board meetings each county had a month. But in terms of process, Sheboygan County's process was that before an item got to the county board, it actually had to go through two committees.
That's right. And I think the main focus of what we were looking at, like you said, was how many times they met per month. Beyond that, I don't recall, without going back and looking at those notes from rules review, exactly what the other discussion was. But I do agree with Supervisor Longenhahn and your recollection. Sheboygan County was unique in that they required an agenda item to go through two standing committees before it made it to the full board.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Supervisor Langen.
So then we never looked at how something gets placed on a committee in other counties. It was just to the full board? Got it. Thank you.
Okay, Supervisor Baker.
Thank you, Chair Gibbs. I want to read just a paragraph from Zucchino versus Dane County. This was the circuit court judge. I think good government requires communication between board members. It wouldn't make sense to me for a county board to act as if I said to you, from now on, don't ever talk to each other. Don't share information. Don't discuss anything until you get to the county board meeting. That certainly would be good advice if you never want to be sued ever again on claims of a walking quorum. It really wouldn't make for good government, because good government does require exchange of information and benefiting by the input and information given by your colleagues on a government board, much like I'm sure state senators and state assemblymen talk about issues that are coming before them. Thank you.
Any other discussion? Vice Chair McKeown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As it's very obvious there are going to be a lot of items coming up for rules review. That's why I encourage members of the board to come to the rules review committees when we have the meetings, because, like I said, there's that issue that Supervisor Dickinson brought up about the chair comes to infrastructure, says, I want you to put that on there. What if I don't want it on there? That's not addressed. I'm assuming it's something that's going to be worked out, but that's an issue that isn't addressed in that also. The chair, I was assuming that the chair of each committee is responsible for their agenda. So like I said, those are issues that probably need to be cleaned up in here also. So like I said, it's good to have more input from the whole county board when we have these meetings. Thank you.
Any other discussion?
Mr. Chair, last comment, final comment.
Mr. Langenhahn, please.
So thank you. I appreciate Supervisor McEwen's comments, because I won't say wish issue, but that happened to me this term. That did happen. And I trusted the process that whatever the issue was that got brought up in front of my committee, it had to have been worthwhile for us to put a process like this in place in order for it to arrive there. I'm happy to discuss it again, though, because I believe in the power of the committee chairs and how they should be able to set the agendas. All right, I'm done, Mr. Chair.
Okay, does anybody wish to take action on this agenda item? Supervisor Dickinson.
So given those last two comments, I'm going to make a motion to approve the rule change that's before us.
Is there a second? Is there a second? Does anybody online wish to make a second? Okay, seeing no second, the motion dies due to a lack of a second. We will move on. Supervisor Robinson.
I would move to refer this issue to the Rules Review Committee for their consideration.
So the question I would have, we can put that on a list of items for the rules to review to take a look at. However, I don't know, a motion needed to refer it would be appropriate without the committee being formed at this point yet.
That's a great question, Mr. Chair. The Rules Review Committee exists in the rules, but it's not been formed at this time. So I think the motion would be in order, but it would just, in effect, be an item on a list for that committee to review once it's formed.
I'd second that.
Okay, so the motion to refer to the Rules Review for them to take up when they become formed by our rules. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Thank you. We will put it on the list for rules to review when they are formed. Moving on. Item 6B2, BEAD Local Planning Grants. Supervisor Robinson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is an issue that just came to our attention last week. The Public Service Commission had sent out notification to municipal leaders relative to an opportunity to participate in planning. We have to let our intent known by March 7th, and we were out of cycle with all the appropriate standing committees, infrastructure, broadband task force, and others, with the feeling that we needed to take it to the county board to get that approval. So there's $1.5 million available for planning activities that will help develop the plan and how they will allocate Wisconsin's portion of the $42.5 billion available for broadband expansion. There will be subsequent documents, but if we want to get in to the early planning stage, it's important for us to adopt this resolution. I think one of the things that we can consider at the Broadband Task Force is whether we'll work with Synergy and others on it from a regional economic development basis in order to qualify for 10% more funding. I'm not sure exactly how this will roll out, but again, there was a short turnaround, and we felt it important to bring it to the board and therefore run it through this committee. And again, we have to act by March 7th.
Any other discussion? The other thing I would just add is, with the new broadband maps being generated by Public Service Commission, or excuse me, at the Public Service Commission, identifying broadband availability down to a granular level. The challenge is that those maps are still very flawed. In some cases, they are showing in addresses in Marathon County that a company serves them that nobody in this county has heard of. So I really question whether or not we need additional, and understanding. Just attending NACO last week, NACO said that literally the 46 billion, of broadband money under the bipartisan infrastructure bill, those maps will be critical in how that funding is deployed first to the states, and then the states will develop the planning of how they're going to deploy those funds locally. So it's critical that we actually take action to be able to assist in developing a plan for to challenge those maps, and to develop a strategy to get broadband to all of the residents in the county. Supervisor Dickinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I had a couple questions. So is the grant for funding to participate in the planning process? That's what we're looking to be, like have a seat at the table would be one question. And it seems like it says 1.5 million, so there's going to be potentially, all the counties and all the tribes that our portion is going to be pretty small, probably in the tens of thousands of dollars if everyone participates.
I'm not sure if, I know that 1.5 million is not meant to be allocated directly to all the parties that are interested. That also includes the PSC staff time and those planning efforts. I'm not sure of how that money will be developed, but the state will be tasked with developing a plan that will allocate those dollars coming in. I think it's important that we have a seat at the table whenever possible. For doing that. We have some areas of the county, such as the Harrison area and some of those that are in the corners of the county where it may make sense for us to look at Langlade, Lincoln, Taylor, and other counties to cooperate, which may allow us to advance others. In addition, the governor in his budget yesterday unveiled funding or indicated funding request of GPR of $750 million over the biennium for broadband expansion. The federal money won't be adequate, clearly, and so there's a need for us to plan in any planning effort that will take place relative to how we will access the federal funds. Will also have some good application as it relates to how the state funds may be spent going forward. So I'm thinking that this will, it will allow us to utilize PSC to do bulk challenges to some of the data that are part of the fabric that the Federal Communication Commission has put together, or I'm hopeful that will be part of it. But again, there are other agreements that will be coming forward, and I think we're responding to a request for interest, and I think we're interested.
Okay, so to follow up.
Go ahead, please.
Do we have to participate in this in order to receive any of those additional funds that were mentioned under ARPA, IRA, BIL? It wouldn't seem so. It seems like this is more of a planning process. I don't think we would be excluded. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. I think we're just trying to plan, and I think more information will be coming out, but I don't see anything that would prohibit us, if we decided not to be part of the process, from making an application in the future. The question is, what parameters and criteria will the state plan have when it is rolled out? I think you want to be at the table when the criteria or process is developed, and I think that's part of this effort, to try to get as many communities engaged as possible.
Thank you.
Any other discussion? Supervisor Marash and then Supervisor Langenhan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So while reviewing all of this, and it is new to me, and I'm not on the broadband task force or anything like that, so, and maybe you don't have the answers to these questions, but one question was, why do the counties who work collaboratively through the Regional Economic Development Organization receive a 10% allocation increase?
You'd have to ask the PSC, but my gut feel is that it's meant to be more regional and collaborative in trying to deal with it on a regional basis, and that there are some economies to doing that. But I don't know.
I think the other thing is it's so that you don't stop at the Marathon County border. When you're looking at planning for broadband expansion, it does include going across possibly Taylor County into Clark County in the corner or on borders. The regional planning offices assist in that planning.
And then my second question is, what kind of applicable grant compliance requirements and project deliverables can we expect?
I'm not sure on the planning effort, but typically when the dollars have passed through under Wisconsin law, we can't be a direct applicant. We are a partner with other internet service providers. The onus of compliance is upon them. We are, for instance, right now working on an agreement with Frontier. They've got a recent PSC grant application where we pledged $944,000 toward it. They will be on the hook with the Public Service Commission relative to their application. We will then have a separate term sheet or an agreement with Frontier as to when we will release our money to them. In the past, we have had a reimbursement program where once they do the work and submit the invoices to us, we will provide it. We also, as part of the bug tussle agreement with the conduit bonding, we have a formal agreement that all counties that are part of that have entered into that there are many aspects to it, including access to their towers, giving us some of their fiber and other things. But generally, the compliance and the requirements with the other entities falls upon the internet service provider, to which we will partner with that provider and not be a direct recipient.
Thank you.
Any other discussion? Supervisor Langenau, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll move to approve the resolution for authorizing the application for the BEAD grant.
Seconded by Supervisor Robinson. Any discussion? Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion to approve and move to the full board for its consideration the authorization of the application for the BEAD grant signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Motion carries. Thank you. And we will move on to item 6B3, Energy Task Force Charter. And we have Deputy Administrator, Mr. Holman, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, everybody. So I've been working with HR, Finance, and Property and Supervisor Lemmer on this process and discussion to bring to you today. Essentially, the Energy Task Force, as you know, would be created, if it were to be created, would be to accomplish certain tasks, which, in theory, could range from policy establishment to recommendations for projects of variable scales. The mission, purpose, and outcomes, and this is kind of a general framework, and in my discussions with the committee and Supervisor Lemmer, I think it was important to try to focus the task force's kind of initial foray into this space, because sometimes conversations can kind of be too broad so that you end up spinning your wheels versus getting somewhere. But if we were to establish a countywide energy policy or policies that would help guide decisions beyond what's already in the strategic plan, it would be sort of asking staff and essentially committees and the board to contribute more energy to this issue than we have in the past. And we do some things in the general direction of trying to be more efficient and things like that, but it tends to be limited to things like shifting from a normal light bulb to an LED bulb, and there's not a lot of funding associated with that. But in general, I think the main thrust of the idea is to find ways to make energy use across the county more affordable. And so there might be strategies through the conversation to mitigate some of the costs or cost increases. Similarly, making things more reliable. So there could be potential service issues, and this is not to say that the utilities aren't wonderful, they certainly are. It's just that we know that the grid is experiencing a variety of different challenges, whether that be the energy going through it or people disrupting it, anything along those lines, which is a segue into being more resilient in a sense of continuity of operations during emergencies. So we've definitely witnessed certain emergencies, even recently with those derecho storms and things that really knocked out power to a lot of areas. And I wouldn't suggest that this is going to resolve everything. We certainly have diesel generators in key areas for these sorts of things, but they also have load capacity on those generators. So you inevitably end up in a point where certain people are able to continue doing something, whereas others are not. So expanding upon that to provide more potential energy during those situations could be another part of this discussion and framework. But also, as we've noticed in the last year or so, more sustainable in a sense of putting ourselves into a better position to navigate the fluctuations in energy availability, whether that be natural gas prices or diesel prices or energy prices in general. These are things that are largely out of our control. So if there's anything that we could do to, again, mitigate some of those impacts, then it would ultimately, and this is my perspective, put the county into a more predictable or more stable financial situation when those spikes occur. Again, I don't think that there's going to be some sort of panacea here, but it's just the idea of expanding how we approach this to try to mitigate more than we currently do. But the overall goal would be to maximize efficiencies And also with all the different legislation that's going around at the state and federal level, finding ways to capitalize on those incentives to assist the county in moving in this direction. So for part of the justification, as if you recall, utility costs for the county, I think the increase this past year was 6% for electricity, but we spent a little over $400,000 extra dollars on utility costs just between 2022 and 2023. So if that trend continues, that's obviously going to infringe upon other areas of the budget. So again, my particular perspective is really honing in on how do you try to mitigate financial pressures in this area. Because I think if you can, then either the returns on investment, which would have to be there, can either feed back into doing more of this or can go to other areas of the county and also address things that have come up in the past, similar like maintaining a stable mill rate, things like this. You've also seen in the news that there's been recent outages in Wisconsin, but across the country there's different, there's a real gamut of things that are happening to different areas of the country in terms of grid vulnerabilities. And that would probably include in the grander scheme sort of the cybersecurity piece to some of this, and certainly on utilities radar, but ultimately we're on the receiving end of whatever happens to the grid. And so again, trying to put ourselves into a better position to navigate those things. There are various financial opportunities available to the county. Some of them were just referenced, the infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act. There's other state programs. I know Supervisor Baker sits on the PACE board. So things like, there's a litany of things that are there, and they're continuing to emerge as this shift from a utility perspective to sort of broadening of their portfolio and how they produce energy is something that we can kind of leverage in our own way. And then ultimately, the county comp plan does include utility and energy goals, which are referenced there at the bottom of the slide, but essentially to promote energy conservation and the increased use of renewable energy, but adopting innovative policies and practices for energy efficiency and sustainable building design. And I should be clear here, too, that I don't think that if the task force were to be created, there's some sort of predestined outcome. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be one large project or two to try to address it. I think there's a real broad spectrum of strategies and approaches that you could look at to try to mitigate things. I mean, simple things like adjusting the thermostat or turning the lights off when you leave, but kind of formalizing some of those things so that they become less of a habitual thing and more of a, here's how we try to limit the costs in these areas. When it comes to POPSWell membership, these are just recommendations and ideas based on where committees operate. So each one of those listing a couple of things in the parentheses to kind of reference why they would be there. This is not deterministic by any sense, but it would give you a sense of who could have a role in that conversation from the committee and county board perspective. It would be very important to engage our utilities early and often in this discussion as well, because as we know, they've got their own issues that they're working through, but the county also has discussions or has a somewhat limited role, but also you're seeing more and more of these larger projects happening through the PSC. And so those are moving through in different parts of the county, different parts of the state. I think the last time I checked for the Midwest, there was something around 76 major projects being put in through by utilities, and almost half of those, or I don't know if half of them, but a large portion of them are in Wisconsin. And so there's a lot of utility movement in this area, so it would make a lot of sense to align whatever we're looking at trying to do with them. And they may also have ideas that we're not thinking about. In terms of duties and responsibilities, really it'd be sort of to research and coordinate and then ultimately provide any recommendations for policy, projects, anything that would come out of the conversations. It would not be limited to the things there in bullet points, but you would want to start maintaining a baseline data to kind of inform the conversation so people know what they're talking about and what they're even trying to mitigate. Same thing with looking at areas of opportunity. So I was referencing some of those earlier, but I do think it's sort of a cast a wide net and figure out what are the low-hanging fruit, what might be something longer term. But ultimately, anything that we would do, you'd want to make sure has that return on investment. Some might be shorter, some might be longer, but at the end of the day, whatever the task force would bring back, in my opinion, would have to pencil. You're not going to bring back something that's a feel-good measure, to do something that doesn't really provide that sort of fiscal relief. Similarly, identifying the costs of implementation and any benefits of the suggested changes, and then looking at partners to include in the conversations. So that gets back to the focus point in the sense of not necessarily casting a wide net on stakeholders out of the gate and saying, all those interested in this issue come and talk, but figure out where is the task force thinking of going, should it get created, and then at different stages bring the appropriate people in so that they can contribute, provide the input that the task force is looking for, and then they don't have to be continuing to play a role there, but the task force ultimately gets what they need, and you're not trying to convene meetings that are too large and kind of get ungainly. The timeline is somewhat vague just because there's a lot of different things that can happen in the interim, but just in a general sense, if it were to be established, in the spring, you'd really start looking at defining the goals, gathering data, and then creating that plan that I was referencing to say, who are we going to need to talk to about what we're interested in doing? And then in summer, kind of begin focus meetings based on the goals that are set through those early discussions. And the fall, and this is just a hypothetical, but potentially if there was some sort of project through CIP, you would bring it through the budget process, bring it through human resources so that, you're making sure that you're aligning those parts of the timeline with the task force with the county's budget process. Winter 2023, we can incorporate in recommendations on policy or CIP process then. But this is just, it's somewhat aggressive, but it's also trying to keep things moving quickly so that it doesn't linger and people don't, kind of lose track of what did we talk about last time, that sort of thing. So looking ahead, and these things would be sort of dictated through the creation of the charter, but, clearly the task force would need to report to the board and other relevant committees. It could be quarterly. If there were CIP projects, they would need to work with staff and others to initiate those. Similarly, if there were supply chain issues or any delays were experienced and ARPA funds are utilized, if that was going to be something that the county was interested in doing, we know that there's a limited time frame for the use of ARPA funds. So making sure that if there were projects identified, that we don't push ourselves past that if that was the goal. And then for the purposes of proposing the creation, incorporating input from the committee, such as yourself, into that final proposal, and then getting considered by the board, potentially adoption in March, but depending on how this goes. The task force charter that was in your packet kind of re-summarizes everything I went through on the slides in a written form, and that just helps to kind of frame out the resolution and things like that. But ultimately, I think the root question to you, and if it moves forward to the board, is do we want to have this conversation or not? And if we do, then I think that the key is to have a focused conversation out of the gate with some of the parameters here included in the presentation, and of course anything else that comes out of your conversation and or the board's.
Supervisor Robinson, please.
Thank you. This was considered recommended for approval by the Human Resources Finance Committee, and I just want to reiterate some of the reasons for it. We saw a significant increase in the natural gas prices last year to the point where we dipped into the ARPA funds to cover that, hoping that it would be more of a one-time event, but there's no guarantee that will occur. But the Inflation Reduction Act created some unique opportunities, and there are some credits that are available to local governments that were never there before. In the past, many times when you put new energy systems in place, there was a tax credit back to the for-profit entity, and nonprofits and governments couldn't really take advantage of it. The new legislation allows you to get the payment for the equivalent of that tax credit to the local government. So it may be 30%, which would reduce your cost. But the advantage of this is that there are a number of programs that are out there. I know that at the Metropolitan Planning Organization, we recently entertained proposals from a number of communities, including Rib Mountain in Weston, to use electric vehicles in their Department of Public Works. The city of Wausau looked at changing the lighting around community to become more energy efficient to result in savings. There's no reason we couldn't look at that, for instance, in all the parks and other things. So there there are a lot of opportunities. In the past, we've taken advantage of the Focus on Energy program to realize some energy efficiencies, but as a policy, we've never, as a board, have really pushed through some of those energy conservation activities, and in light of the levy limits and constraints, I think it's important for us to take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves and become more prudent purchasers of those services and look for ways to save money and take advantage of the situation ahead of us. And that's what this is meant to do, and we're trying to get it off the ground in time to make some recommendations for next year's budget, should there be opportunities that present themselves, but also to help shape some of those discussions going forward as to what types of vehicles we might be using, what lighting we might be using, energy efficiency, or alternative energy supplies.
Okay, any other discussion? Supervisor Dickinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm not totally opposed to the idea, but as it's written now and how this is moving forward, I'm not going to vote for it. First off, there's nothing in our strategic plan about this. I know it was discussed in the meeting, but there's nothing in our strategic plan about that. Supervisor Lemmer actually stated it was too big, too wide to put into a strategic plan without really studying it. There is a mention about it being in the comp plan, and there's some references there. There were 70 some odd items in the comp plan, but there's a reason why they're not in a strat plan, because we're going through this process. So we're approving this strat plan, going through this process, and here comes this other item kind of coming out of the blue, started on the 24th at HR Finance and then hits 2/8. So to me, it seems rushed. It's happening really quickly. I can understand the justifications economically for that. So the second thing is we approved the administrator's work plan. The full county board did. This is not in the current or future items in the work plan. So there really is no focus of the administration on this whatsoever. So we're going to have to make another amendment to that so that can be done. The third part is we talked a lot about the work plan and the amount of work that's happening in the administration. We've had a lot of discussion about being overworked, being taxed. We've also talked about these other priorities that are coming up. Mental health is noted as a priority now in the strategic plan. We talked about childcare, we talked about housing, but here's another item that's going to be thrown on the table. I just don't think that the resources are available for us to be taking on this at this time, moving this quickly. So that is a significant concern of mine. Additionally, we're talking about the budget process. That was identified as the county board as very significant, and there is work being done on that. But that didn't come in just a few weeks either. And I understand it's coming, but there, again, we're getting into what work we should be doing now, what we've already approved, that sort of thing. Number two, getting to the charter itself and the code itself. It talks about in the mission that the task force is to establish policy and policies. The wording on that concerns me, because I would think that the task force would be focused on recommendations and guidance for the board to make policy, because I believe the board is the policy-making body. So I have a concern with the language in there, additional language such as between 6 and 10 members, between 5 and 7 board members, between 1 and 3. Well, if we're going to be voting on this and approving this, I would think that this should be tight. This should be ready to go for us to vote, and we're not going to be making the adjustments to it, that could come to us at some point where it's very clear about how many members are going to be on it from the board. All of our committees have a lot of work to do, and now potentially we're going to have every committee doing more of this work, being involved in this, as it's stated here. When we talk about quorum issues and stuff, well, I'll leave it at that. Additionally, there's not really like an end point. There's not, what would be the point at which the task force goes away? The Regional Morgue Task Force and a Broadband Task Force are the two that we have. I would think there's a point at which they would go away. Is the Energy Task Force going to have an end date, or is it just undefined? Is there a particular goal? I would think that would be helpful for us to know. And the last kind of grouping I'll say here, and I don't want to sound questioning or untrusting or something, Supervisor Lemmer did state on the 124 HR Finance meeting that she's on green alert. That's what she had said. She was pretty excited about that. And you mentioned broadening of the portfolio of what we do with energy. She mentioned EV, solar, wind, and heat pumps, carbon credits. So my question for the task force is the task force to help us find cost reductions? Is it about those kinds of things, or is it about renewable energy? I think that needs to be clearly delineated what its job is. So you did mention there is no predestined outcome. Well, potentially, some people might be going into this thinking, hey, we're going green. We're going to be Bayfield County. They wanted to go green. They started stepping through. Is that what we're doing here? Or are we looking at costs? Are we looking at efficiencies, solar on top of the buildings? And with that mindset, the last thing I'll say is this for the county government, or is this for the entire county? Are we setting forth some kind of recommendation or policy for individuals, for every municipality, for them to do a similar thing? Or is it really just focused on us, trying to find some costs? So thank you. I went a little longer than I thought. Thanks.
Other discussion? Supervisor Robinson?
I would like to just address one of the points. This was part of the HR Finance Committee work plan discussions for the last 2+ years. So it's while the charter in the task force is new, the whole concept of trying to become more sustainable and energy efficient has been a point of discussion for almost 3 years. So it's and I think, again, because of the opportunities, you raised some good points relative to the certainty in terms of the members, but whether there should be a sunset in focus. I think the intent is to be internal, orientated to the county operations, not to be external to the community as a whole, because we don't have control over that. And the goal was to be looking at our operations, our policies and procedures, and how we can effectuate a change or improvement and rely on energies. I know we looked to, ERC has looked at a number of things. We had a brief discussion on carbon credits for the forest, but those are types of things that we could look at internally. So I think that there is adequate to do, and it can be tightened up either today or in the near future.
I think one of the things, and I'm not totally disagreeing with Supervisor Dickinson, but I think when you look at the duties and the responsibilities, do research, coordinate, and provide recommendations for options. Recommendations and options for policy changes. So they're not saying that they are going to make policy changes, it's recommendations of policy changes. Now, there is potential areas where it needs cleaned up, and I don't disagree with that, but as Supervisor Robinson said, it's something that has been looked at for 2 years at HR Finance. Is there opportunities for this county in its fiscal responsibility of the taxpayers of the county to look at potential energy savings for the county and the county taxpayers? That's the question.
I can just also, I think part of the timeliness piece is that there are sort of deadlines, like I referenced ARPA. So we know that ARPA's got a window that shuts. We know that these federal and state programs, they disperse funds, but those funds ultimately end up going away. And so I think the point of trying to get going sooner rather than later is to, if there's something that comes from it, that you're getting in line so that you're going to increase the odds of actually being able to harness some of that. And we had a very similar conversation with the water testing and all this with the state program, because the sooner we could get CPZ working on that area, the sooner county residents could actually start accessing some of the state funds if they were eligible. So it's the same sort of idea. And I think too, I'm not trying to reference the financial piece of it to try to disguise anything. I think that is the overriding concern. And we all know that we have to live within fiscal pressures that are, unrelenting in terms of over the last couple decades or so. So I think if we as a county found financial savings in any of this, then anything else that comes of it, or how anybody else might see it, is, personally not a big concern. My primary overriding concern in terms of how we look at this is not how green we might be or which part of an alternate energy source you're using. It's more along the lines of, is there an opportunity to save money or to stabilize something or to mitigate increases in costs? And if they are, then should we do them or not? And in my sense, the strongest argument there is, are you saving money, or are you providing more financial stability to the county, and not necessarily are you checking boxes for other people's perspectives or philosophies? I think that's not a concern of mine.
I think the other thing that is this was brought for discussion, so it's ripe for discussion as far as changes and recommendations for changes. Supervisor Dickinson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just so I can clarify so everyone's on the same page, my last comment was my concern, and I think I stated that third. I'm not saying anyone has an agenda, but certainly within that discussion, the renewable energy discussion, for constituents in my area, it is a concern. How do you move forward? Should we have wind turbines, right, which was going to happen in Western Marathon County? Should we have solar? To what degree? Fenwood has solar. I was talking to a gentleman about that who's had a solar farm. I'm not averse to these things. It's about how do we want to move forward, right? And how do we get things done is that focus. It's not in our strat plan. It's not in the work plan. It's not something that we were thinking about, and now it comes forward. And I will say, yes, we can make changes to this. I don't think that's necessarily my job. We are told to watch other meetings. I watched the other meetings about this, and I researched these last two meetings to try to understand. For me to say, okay, should I now rewrite this in almost in full because I think it's not written well? I'm not on board with that. We don't do that with other things. We don't get into real deep rewritings. So if we're going to put this work forward, I don't think we should vote on it as it is now. I don't think we should be doing that at all. We shouldn't be approving this language. I don't think that it's ready for prime time. But if we are going to do this, I will state this, then we need to pull something out of the strategic plan and the work plan. Because we're being told, and not my words, the administrator is saying they are taxed with work. And this is going to take a lot of resource. And yes, we could save money potentially, right? There's that whole argument. How much do you really save? That's a discussion. Yes, we could save money. Yes, we can get more federal money or state money or whatever that might be. That's wonderful. But there's other costs associated with doing that. And what else is it going to cost the county if we don't do something else? That's where I'm at. So to be very clear, because I guess I have to state these things in a meeting very clearly, I'm not opposed to the idea. I don't think it should be done now. If we want to move this later on in the year when it's tidied up and then we want to move forward with it, fine. But doing this right now, it just doesn't fit with anything that we've done up until this point with the work plan. Thank you.
Any other discussion?
Mr. Chair?
Supervisor Longeman, please.
Well, if the ideas are of merit, then I don't think the conversation should necessarily stop. I agree with Supervisor Dickinson that there are some concerns in the charter that's presented in front of us today, but that doesn't mean that HR Finance couldn't do more work on this and present it to the executive committee. The other thing that I would note is that in regards to the administrator's work plan, I agree. I was part of those same discussions as well as far as the amount of work that we place on administration. We also have a deputy administrator that we haven't had. Chris, when did you start?
End of last May.
Yeah, end of last May. So I think that also has to be weighed into this as well. I would feel more comfortable if, given the concerns that Supervisor Dickinson raised today, that this be referred back to HR Finance and have them do a little bit more work, and then have it be represented to the executive committee.
Is that your motion?
Yeah, that'll be my motion.
Is there a second? Second by Vice Chair McEwen. Any further discussion? And I would take note that the items that were brought forward by Supervisor Dickinson be the starting point for the recommendations for discussion when HR Finance Committee takes these items back up, if it is the wish of this committee. Supervisor Langenau.
I would just add, as part of that reapproach then, consider the workload in the administrator's work plan and also how this fits into the strategic plan, because again, to Supervisor Dickinson's point, lacking direction there, and I understand that this has the potential to impact a lot of different service areas in the county, but let's be more defined in our approach.
Okay, any further discussion?
Exactly what his motion is.
Your motion was to refer back to
Move that we refer the charter back to HR Finance and Property, and for them to revise it based on the
revise it based on the discussions
that took place at the executive committee. Thank you.
Okay. Any further discussion?
Is that consistent with my second? It is. Thank you.
Okay, any further discussion?
I just have one question.
Yep, go ahead.
I just have one kind of clarifying question in terms of, as I understand it, there's a specific process in terms of how the task force is created. And so like the membership piece, it's purposely vague because we couldn't, be presumptuous and say, these are the individuals who would be on it. But when we bring it back, is there sort of a hypothetical framework where we would talk to somebody and say, these are the individuals who are interested in serving on it, even though that is ahead of the point of even being created, and I think the chair assigning anybody to that task force, just to kind of narrow the focus again, like you're saying.
Supervisor Robinson?
I think the intent was to be directional and say if the intent is to have a representative from ERC, from infrastructure and others, we will, instead of having a range, we'll say it will be X number of members, including a representative from these. Okay. It is ultimately up to the county board chair, subject to the confirmation of the county board, to make those appointments. So we will be more rigid in no ranges.
Supervisor Langenau.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just add to Supervisor Robinson's comments, I don't expect for there to be specific names, of course, in this charter as far as who will serve. I don't expect that at all. The groups that were named there, that's a fine start, but I think you can narrow that down into more defined areas. But I would just add, Mr. Chair, if Deputy Administrator would object, I took your question more as it was more directed towards Supervisor Dickinson. Am I correct, or are you throwing that out to everybody?
Just in general, I just want to make sure that we're hitting the mark in terms of how to tighten it up. I mean, and certainly I'll rewatch this portion of the meeting too and reference my notes, but I didn't want to have anything left out that I might have not fully understood and appreciated.
All right. Thank you.
Further discussion? Supervisor Dickinson, please.
I was just going to say that I can forward the information I have, the items that I saw, I could forward it to John. How's that?
Perfect. Any other discussion? Motion is to refer back to HR Finance Property Committee for rework and address the items that were discussed by the exec committee, at least, and have a discussion at that committee moving forward. All those in favor of that motion to forward to the HR Finance Committee the proposed charter signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. And that brings us down to the next meeting date and time and announcements for future agenda items. Committee members are asked to bring ideas for future discussion. Next meeting is March 9th, 2023, 3 o'clock. And Supervisor Robinson with the motion, with it?
I was just going to ask if we could have a high-level overview of the budget.
High-level overview of the budget, absolutely. Any other discussion? Any other requests? We're down to item number 9, motion by Supervisor Dickinson and seconded by Supervisor Langenhahn to adjourn. Any discussion? All those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye. 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 Opposed? Motion carried. We stand adjourned. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Barnes, I don't know if Barnes is this long. Nice.
Good catch.
Thank you. Otherwise, it was going to be like a baton.
Yeah.
Relay race.
Yeah.